World of Warcraft, Beyond the Dark Portal, by Aaron Rosenberg and Christy Golden. Chapter 5. A what? Tyralian, General of the Alliance forces, Paladin of the Silverhand, stared in utter bafflement at the tiny figure who sat before him. The rat's problem, the gnome exclaimed. When you said you had an issue with the wildlife that was threatening to derail the entire tram construction project, Tyralian said slowly, I assume you had run into difficulties with the subterranean lake or perhaps the creatures in. Tyralian's voice trailed off. You did say rat. Indeed. Tinkerer Gelbin Mechatork, head of the project to construct a mechanical transport system that would eventually link Stormwind and Ironforge, shuddered. Horrible little vermin. Some bodies were this big. Mechatork spread his hands about 6 inches apart. Granted, on the tiny frame, that was a substantial amount, but still, the engineer had called an emergency situation with the general of the Alliance over the rat problem. Tyralian still wasn't quite sure what to think of the small beings who were good friends with the dwarves. If Mechatork, who had come to Stormwind a few years ago with a full endorsement of the dwarves, King Manny Bronzebeard himself, was any indication, they were a curious bunch. Mechatork talked fast and used terms that Tyralian was utterly unfamiliar with, and struck him as a jovial fellow. The gnome representative didn't even reach Tyralian's hip when standing, and was all but swallowed by a large chair in which he was now ensconced. The table was level with his bright eyes, and at one point Mechatork let out an exasperated humph and simply climbed on top it to point at the blueprints he had unfolded within 2 minutes of his arrival. They've completely infested the prototypes, chewing through the wiring here, and here. Mechatork continued, stabbing a tiny finger down at blueprints. We can't extract it or even get to repair it without losing more good people to those vile creatures. The last tram we sent in after it, well, it wasn't a pretty sight. His large eyes looked solemn. Tyralian nodded. The idea of a tram had struck him as brilliant when it was first proposed, shortly after the Second War. Progress on rebuilding Stormwind had been made, but slowly. It was a long and dangerous trek from Ironforge to Stormwind, and King Bronzebeard had chaffed at the delay in getting supplies to his allies. Tyralian felt out of his depth at the time, and still had that reaction every time Mechatork came to him with updates or problems. He was a paladin, a warrior by fate, and a priest by training. He knew little enough of simple construction, and this tram was quite beyond him, especially when Mechatork talked so fast. Tyralian had discovered that gnomes were fiercely, if radically, intelligent, and he was willing to believe it if this contraption that Mechatork proposed did even part of what it claimed it would do. He remembered their first conversation. How safe will it be? He had asked. Well, we are on the cutting edge of technology with it, you must understand, Mechatork had said, running a hand along his mutton-chop whiskers. But I'm willing to bet it'll eventually be as safe as the safest gnomish creation ever! Something in the sound of his voice had warned Tyralian that it might not be particularly safe at all. But he wasn't a builder or an engineer. Still, it was coming along. Until this rat problem. I understand that rats are proportionally much larger and therefore much more threatening to your people than mine, Tyralian said as diplomatically as he could, although he wondered why Bronzebeard hadn't handled the problem on the Ironforge end. And we can't have them chewing through the wiring. I'll send some of my men back to Ironforge with you. They'll, hunt down the vermin and help you effect repairs. Tyralian might have been Great Father Winter himself the way Mechatork reacted. Thank you! This is excellent. I'll be back on track in a jiffy, and then we can finally tackle that pesky underwater problem. The gnome slipped off the chair and reached up a small hand to Tyralian, then pumped it vigorously. Go speak to Amarella, Tyralian said, referring to a former guard at the keep who now served as Tyralian's assistant in all things non-military. He'll take care of the arrangements. Tyralian watched the gnome depart and turned back to his correspondence. Dozens of letters from so many people, all wanting something from him. He ran a hand through his short blonde hair and sighed. A walk would do him good. The air was clean and clear, and he stepped outside, although clouds lowered. He walked up the canal, gazing briefly at his reflection in the now cleared water. Trollian had never been to Stormwind until the day he and his men had entered the city 2 years ago, and so he had not had the additional horror of knowing what the city had been like before it fell. It was horrific enough as it was. These famous canals had been clogged with stones and lumber, with dirt with defiled corpses. The dead had been respectfully buried and the rubble cleared. Now the canals ran freely again, connecting to the various parts of the city. Trollian lifted his gaze to a white stone, gray now in the dimming light, and the red roofs. The dwarven district housing many of the Bronzebeard's hard-working men sent along with Mekatork, and nestled next to that area was the cathedral. Thunder rumbled as he approached. He fixed his eyes on the glorious building, one of the first to be completed in its entirety. The orcs had damaged it badly, but even then it was a place of safety. The enemy had not realized the cathedral had vast rooms and catacombs beneath it. Dozens had huddled there, sheltered by its stone, while terror raged above them. It was one of the few buildings large enough to house the refugees in its initial stages of reconstruction, and even now people flocked to it when they were ill or injured, or even just need a little bit of a reminder of the light. Like Trollian. Oof. He stepped forward, so lost in thought that he hadn't seen a pair of children until they slammed into him. "Sorry, mister," the boy cried, the girl gazing up at him with solemn brown eyes. Trollian smiled and patted her hair as he spoke to the boy. "With an attack like that, you'll make a fine soldier one day," he said. "Oh, yes, sir. I hope so, sir. I think all the orcs will be dead before I'm old enough to kill them." Trollian's smile faltered. "I'm sure you'll be able to serve the Alliance well," he said, evading the question. Revenge, the fiery need and anger it kindled in the heart, had cost Trollian someone he loved. He would say nothing to foster racial hatred in a child. Keeping his hand on the girl's head, he murmured a soft prayer. Light glowed around his hands, and for a brief moment the child was enveloped in radiance. Trollian lifted his other hand and blessed the boy as well. Awe shone in both pairs of eyes that regarded him. "Light bless you both. Now you two best be getting home. It looks like rain." The boy nodded and grabbed his sister's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Paladin." The two ran towards their home. It was not far. Trollian realized they lived in the building adjacent to the cathedral, the orphanage. So many orphans. So many lives lost. Thunder rumbled again, and the heavens let loose. Rain began to pour down in sheets. Trollian sighed, pulling his cape around himself and running lightly up the steps to the cathedral, getting soaked even in that short distance. The smell of incense and the soft, barely audible sound of chanting coming from somewhere in the building soothed him at once. Become used to giving orders, to fighting battles, to emerging from them covered in his own blood or that of the orcs, it was good to come back to the church and to remember his origins as a simple priest. A soft smile curved his lips as he beheld his brethren, his fellow knights of the Silver Hand, doing their duties here as surely as they had on the battlefield. Archbishop Alonsus Fowl had created the order 3 years ago, and it was by his decree that the paladins now served humbly in the communities that had been so devastated by the war. Even as he looked around, Trollian saw his old friend Uther, whom he himself had given the title Lightbringer. Trollian was used to seeing the powerfully built man in full armor swinging his weapon, his ocean-colored eyes afire with zeal as light came to him in the form of powerful attacks. But Uther was now clad in simple robes. He was attending to a woman who looked exhausted and drained, gently wiping her forehead with a damp cloth and cradling something in his free hand. As Trollian drew closer, he saw that the bundle Uther held so gently was a newborn, its skin still moistened from birth. The new mother smiled tiredly but happily and reached for her child. Its lusty, healthy wail was the sharp, sweet song of hope. Uther rested his hand on the woman and blessed her and her child, as Trollian had done with the orphans earlier. Trollian realized that, although Uther was obviously at home on the battlefield, using the light to take the lives of those who would slay him and those who he served, he was equally at home here in the cathedral, bringing a new little life into this world. Such was the dichotomy of the paladins. They were warriors and healers both. Uther glanced up and smiled, rising to greet a friend. "Trollian," he said in his deep, gruff voice. The two paladins clasped hands. "Good to see you. About time you found your way down here." Uther chuffed the younger man playfully. "You're right," Trollian agreed, chuckling. "It is good to be here. It is too easy to get caught up in all the things that need to be done, but can never quite be finished, like a rat problem." "Eh? I'll tell you later. For now, how can I help?" This was what mattered, he thought, not staying holed up in the keep pushing papers. Uther's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked over Trollian's shoulder. "I think you've got some of that unfinished business right. I think you've got some of that unfinished business right here," he said. "Oh?" Trollian said casually, turning around. It was like seeing a ghost, a moment wrenched out of its proper place in space and time, and incongruously reincarnated. She stood before him, face and hair and clothing wet, emerald eyes fixed with his eyes. She had gotten caught in the rain, looking almost as she had that night nearly 2 years ago, coming to him now as she had come to. Illyria Windrunner's eyes narrowed, as if she too recalled that night and found it an unpleasant memory. Trollian felt a chill sweep over him that had nothing to do with his wet clothing. She bowed stiffly, first to Uther, then to him. "Lightbringer, General." Ah, this was how it was to be played then. "Ranger?" He was surprised at how calm his voice sounded. He was half expecting it to crack with emotion. "What brings you here?" "Tidings," she said, "of the worst sort." Her eyes flickered to Trollian's, then back to Uther's. "Little else would." Trollian felt a muscle twitch in his cheek and gritted his teeth. "Then pray, deliver them." The elf looked around, slightly contemptuous. I wonder if I have not come to the wrong place for aid. I did not expect to find generals, knights, and holy warriors tending to babies in church." Trollian welcomed the anger. It chased away the heart sickness. We serve where we are called, Illyria. All of us. I feel certain you didn't come all the way here just to insult us. Speak." Illyria sighed. "A short time ago, I met with Khadgar and several of the Alliance leaders, including your own king. It seems that there is a dimensional rift where the Dark Portal once stood. Khadgar believes that very soon, orcs, perhaps an entire second horde, could come through again. He sent me on Griffinback at once to inform you." She had their attention now, and they listened in silence as she repeated what she had learned. Not for the first time since the Lion of Azeroth's death, Trollian wished Admiral Lothar were here. He often found himself wishing that when faced with difficult decisions, or impending combat, or simply the need to talk to someone, Lothar would have responded instantly, calmly, but decisively, and others could not have helped but follow. While the veterans of war had begun calling themselves the Sons of Lothar, Trollian himself, Lothar's lieutenant, was not comfortable with the term. He did not feel like a son of the great man, although he would defend Lothar's ideals to his last breath. He was still thinking when Illyria finished talking and turned her eyes expectantly on him. "Well?" she demanded. "What say the Wildhammers in all this? What does Kurdran think?" "I doubt he knows," Illyria admitted, the blonde ranger having the grace to at least be embarrassed by the statement. "What? You flew all this way to inform me on one of their griffins, no less, And no one told the Wildhammer's leader what was going on. She shrugged again, and Trollian bit back a curse. During the Second War, the Alliance had fought together elves, humans, and dwarves, both the Wildhammers and the Bronzebeard cousins, side by side. But in the past year, it seemed the human rulers had been detaching themselves from their non-human allies. The elves still participated in the defense of Nethergate, but that was as much from their fascination with all things magic as from any desire to help the humans. The Bronzebeard dwarves had an ambassador, Muradin Bronzebeard, to Lordaeron, and so they maintained close ties with King Tyrannus and there was cheerful little Mekatork and his assistants here in Stormwind. Trollian felt the heat of shame rush through him as the recollection of his amusement at the gnome's expense earlier. Mekatork and his people were performing an invaluable service to strangers. But for all the Wildhammer's loyalty and bravery and skill, many humans seemed to think the Griffin Riders were little more than savages. Will you wait for the dwarves to give you instructions, or perhaps Lothar's ghost? Trollian frowned. Will you wait for dwarves to give you instructions, or perhaps Lothar's ghost? Trollian frowned. Color rose in Illyria's cheeks, and she glanced down, realizing she had gone too far. The Wildhammers have been staunch allies, Trollian said in a soft yet sure voice. They are as much part of the Alliance as anyone else. I will see to it that they are informed as soon as possible. We must go immediately, Illyria said. The Griffin will bear you to Lordaeron. I will make my own way there. She wasn't even designed to ride with him then. Trollian didn't answer at once. He glanced at Uther, who was bridling on his behalf. Their eyes met for a moment. The bigger man nodded and turned back to the young mother and her child. Will you bring the members of your order? Yes, Illyria said, almost perfunctorily, as if she knew the answer already. When Trollian shook his head, her jaw dropped. What? Why not? The Archbishop wishes them to stay here and in Lordaeron to tend to the people who need them. You haven't even asked. I know without asking, don't worry. If the need is great enough, they will come, but need can take many forms. Come, let us talk for a bit. We should. 5 minutes will not change nothing. She frowned. He realized she was shivering. A drop of rain slid from her wet hair down her face, looking like a tear, but it was nothing nearly so soft. At that instant, he wanted to pull her into his arms so badly. This coldness, this aberrated venom that poisoned her words and turned her lovely face ugly with hatred. He knew what it was, and he knew why she carried it. And the knowing was like a knife to his heart. I wrote. You never answered, he said quietly. She shrugged, pulling her cloak about her slim frame automatically, although what she needed was dry clothing. I have been traveling, on patrol. My most recent task was a patrol through the Illyric Mountains, Illyria said. There are rumors of orcs hiding among the peaks there. She allowed herself a grim smile. We found 10 of them. Trollian didn't have to ask what she and her rangers had done with the discovered orcs. He wondered if she'd started taking trophies. He had seen her once crouching over a body, a savage grin on her face, and had been stunned by the glee she took in the kill. Illyria, he said quietly. I have been writing to you and you've never answered. You owe me nothing, I understand that, but if... What happened between us means you can no longer work with me. I need to know that now. I'm your commander. I, the Alliance, can't afford to find out on the battlefield that you're not listening or not obeying. He waited until she looked at him. Do you have a problem with that? There is no problem, the blonde elf answered sharply. The Alliance wants every orc dead. So do I. We can work together on that. That's all we are to you now. A means to an end. A way to kill more orcs more quickly. What else is there? She answered. Kagger only found me because my band and I were hunting orc renegades in Altaric. I agreed to meet with him at Nethergate because his messenger said it involved orcs, and I agreed to bring his summons to you for the same reason. She frowned. And the sooner we reach Lordaeron, the sooner I can sink out more of those green-skinned abominations and cleanse this land of their filth. Her voice rose with passion and her eyes flashed. Some heads turned in their direction. I will see them dead, every last one of them, even if it takes me 100 years. Tyralion felt a shiver down his spine. Illyria, he begun, pitching his voice low. You're talking genocide. The smile that curved her lips was a cruel one. It's only genocide when those being slain are people. This is nothing more than exterminating vermin. He realized with a shock that she honestly believed her words. She really didn't see the orcs as a sentient people. She saw them as abominations, as monsters, as rats. Tyralion knew he had slain his fair share of them, and had done so at times with great anger in his heart at what they had done to his people. But this? Illyria didn't want justice. She didn't want the orcs to pay for the crimes they committed. She wanted to hurt them, to exterminate an entire race if she could. He took a step towards her, reaching out a hand, hoping to connect. You've lost so much. I know that. Illyria knocked his hand away. A human speaks of loss. What do you know of it? Your lives are so brief, you never learn what it means to truly love someone. Tyralion felt the blood drain from his face. For a moment he couldn't respond. She stared at him, breathing quickly, daring him to speak. Just because you lived longer doesn't mean you feel more, he said. Trust me on that one. He gave her a lopsided smile. Her face only hardened the more. So, you're better than me because you lived for this long? She challenged, snapping her fingers. Or are you better than me because you're precious light? Illyria, I want to see justice done. You know that, but you're not talking justice. You're talking vengeance. And I see what it is doing to you. The light isn't mine, it's everyone's. It's about healing. Don't you dare lecture me, she warned, her voice dropping to a steely hiss. Your holy light did not stop the orcs from tearing open a way into our world, did it? The light can't restore my ravaged homeland or give me back my... She closed her jaw with a snap. Tyralion stared at her for a long moment and sighed deeply. Ranger, he said firmly. Here are my orders. For the moment, you will stay here in Stormwind along with half of my troops and myself. Send for your rangers. Have them gather here. The city has just started to get its feet underneath it. I won't leave it unprotected. Her jaw tightened. So we're going to wait out the war here here, sir. Like cowards, sir? Tyralion did not rise to the bait. I will request reinforcements when they come. We'll leave. But until then, we stay here. She nodded. You'll protect a city when it's your own. Now I see. Permission to leave to gather my rangers, sir? Illyria's words were designed to get under his skin, and they had. But Tyralion was more concerned about what happened to Illyria, or more correctly, what she was doing to herself. To cause her to speak to them. She had changed so very, very much. Sadly, he recalled their first initial reactions to one another. He, stammering, awestruck, first by her grace and beauty, and later by her consummate skill, and she, amused, intrigued, slightly supercullish. He had lost some of his awe. Not all of it. He would never lose all of it, but some. And she had grown to respect him. to like him, to seek out his company, to want him by her side in battle, and he once believed in a more intimate way. But there seemed little of that woman left, and all he could do was be saddened and worried by the changes, and wonder if she'd let her hate for the orcs get in the way of her judgment. By the light, if she died because of this recklessness of hers. He realized he was staring and nodded. He did not trust himself to speak past the lump in his throat. Illyria inclined her head, the barest gesture of requested respect, and strode past him. Turalian watched her go, wondering if he'd make the right decision. What would Lothar have done? Would he have waited until reinforcements came, or would he have charged into battle? Was he wasting time or being smart? Was it enough to send his second-in-command, Daneth Trollbane, and half his men to Nethergate right now? He shook his head, clearing it. He couldn't afford to second-guess right now, and his decision felt like the right one. He needed to send some messengers, one to the Wildhammers, letting them know of the situation, one to Lordaeron, and one, he thought with a small, sad little smile, to Mekkatork, to let him know that, unfortunately, the men intended as rat catchers for the tram would not be coming, after all. Illyria did not head back to the keep, as she had said she would. Instead, once she left the cathedral, she started to run, feet swift and almost completely silent as they carried her along the streets towards the great gates of the city. She ignored startled glances as she ran, commencing the gawking stares to fuel her anger, and raced through the gates into the wooded area beyond. She ran until she found a small stream, and there, beneath the burrows of the sheltered trees, she sank down on the sodden earth. She was cold and soaked to the skin, but she ignored the discomfort. It had gone worse than she had feared. How was it that a mere human could rattle her so? She was a child beside her. He was a child beside her, a rude, loud child who, even as she thought the words, she knew they were wrong. Turalian was shockingly young compared with her, but he was reckoned a man among his own people. And he was kind and wise and smart. And at one point, so long ago it seemed now, she had thought she loved him. Illyria growled and put a clenched hand to her heart as if warning it not to soften. Her fingers touched the wrought of silver of her necklace, and that held 3 precious stones. It had been given to her by her parents. It was a link with a world that had once been, a world of grace and beauty and balance, a world the orcs had forever crippled. The trees were not those of the forest of Eversong, those beautiful golden leaf parchments whose branches had held her and her sisters and squeezed her eyes shut and whispered a name. Lareth. Her youngest brother. She remembered him now, the way he had looked the last time she'd seen him. Beautiful, laughing, dancing beneath golden leaves as a piper played a surprisingly tune. Young, so young. He wanted to be a ranger like his sisters, but in this moment she had frozen forever in her mind. Illyria watched him simply enjoying being alive. The orcs had slaughtered him, snuffing out his bright life like a flame pinched between a crumbling thumb and forefinger. Had slaughtered so many, too many, other cousins, aunts, uncles, nieces, and slaughtered friends she had known longer than Turalian had been alive. They would pay. Her hand tightened on the necklace. They would suffer, as gentle young Lareth had, as her people, her city, her land had. They would taste 1,000-fold the pain they had inflicted upon her. It would be sweet, sweet as the blood as she had once tentatively licked from her hand after a kill. Turalian had almost caught her that time. Now she told herself she must not know. He must not stop her. He must not soften her heart as he had come perilously close to doing once before. Whatever the cost, Illyria Windrunner would have her revenge. Rain poured down outside, but the stables were dry, if steamy. The scent of horses and leather filled the moist air. The beasts whickered, pawing at the hay-covered cobblestone beneath their hooves as their riders saddled them. They were trained war horses and had not been seen battle in some time. They seemed as anxious as Dennis Trollbane was to depart. Dennis' men, though, were greener. His own house had been saddled and ready quickly, and now he moved among his soldiers. "Make haste!" He glowered at one who was having trouble with his stirrups. "This is no pleasure outing." Trelane had let him choose half among all the military left in Stormwind. He'd chosen cavalry unit because he knew would be able to cross the miles quickly and form ranks again soon after. They needed to move fast, but they had to be careful not to wear out the horses. He suspected they wouldn't have the luxury of rest to reorganize and regroup, but most of the men he had fought with were scattered now over the human territories, and there was no time to summon all the veterans home. We don't want to miss the fight, do we, sir?" the soldier said with a grin as he grasped his mount's reins. He was a little more than a boy, really, too young to have fought in the Second War, one of the many who had joined after the war's end to help fill out the ranks so badly decimated by the fighting. Dennis shook his bald head and ran his hand through his silvering beard, trying to recall the boy's name. Farrell, it was. "You've not faced orcs before, have you, Farrell?" he rumbled. "No, sir," Farrell replied with a wide grin that showed how young he really was. "But I'm looking forward to it, sir." "I'm not," Dennis replied, making the soldier gasp and stare. "You're not?" the boy asked, his voice faltering a little, as he noticed his commander's grim expression. But why not, sir? We're going to trample them, aren't we? I heard there weren't many orcs left anymore, and they're hiding in woods and mountains like wild animals." "The ones that got left behind when the portal closed, that's true," Dennis agreed. "But that's not what we're dealing with here. They think the dark portal is going to reopen. Do you know what that means?" The soldier gulped, and Daneth raised his voice to make sure the soldiers saddling their mounts around them could hear him as well. "It means we won't be facing a ragtag group of orc survivors, boy. We're facing the Horde, the largest fighting force ever seen, and that force has never been defeated, not in truth." "But we won, sir! We won the war!" One of the other men, Daneth recalled, protested. "We conquered them!" "That we did," he agreed, "but only because some of their own forces turned on them and we were able to crash them at the sea. What we fought at Blackrock was only a portion of the true Horde, and even then, it was a close thing." He shook his head. "For all we know, there could be as many as a dozen more clans back on the Orcs' homeworld, just waiting to break through again." He heard the murmuring and gas that swept through his men. "That's right, lads," he announced loudly. "We could be heading toward our own deaths here." "Sir, why are you telling us this?" Farrell asked quietly. "Because I don't believe in lying about our chances," his commander answered. "You have a right to know what you'll be facing, and I don't want you going in thinking this will be easy. Expect a hard fight, and stay sharp," he said, his tone shifting from advice to order. "Go in expecting trouble, and you're more likely to survive." He grinned suddenly. "And then you can call yourself Sons of Lothar." All around him, men nodded, more sober now. These were good men. If not as seasoned as he might wish, he already regretted the deaths he knew would come if the portal did indeed reopen. But they were sworn to defend the Alliance, even at the cost of their own lives. He just hoped they wouldn't be dying for nothing, even though precious time was ticking past. Daneth permitted himself a few moments to look at them, and memorize faces, summon names to mind. He had no children of his own. While they were under his command, he was the father to those boys. Even if they were all sons of Lothar, the thought made him smile slightly. "Mount up, lads." 2 minutes later, they were galloping down the cobblestone streets of Stormwind and out the main gates. Listen, you hear that? Randall laughed. You're getting jumpy, William, he told his friend. Just the wind. He glanced around, looking across the blasted landscape, and shivered. Nothing to block it at you. William nodded, but still seemed uneasy. Maybe you're right, he admitted, rubbing his face with one gloved hand. I hate this detail. Why have we got to guard this thing anyway? Isn't it what the Magi are for? Both soldiers glanced behind them. If they squinted, they could make out a shimmer in the air, just beyond the pile of old rubble. The distortion was narrow, perhaps the width of a man, but twice as tall. They had been told that the rift was all that remained of the dark portal, and that their task was to keep watch over it. Don't know, Randall replied. You'd think if anything did happen, Magi would know before we did. He shrugged. At least it's an easy job, and our shift's almost over in another hour. William started to say something else, then stopped, his eyes wide. There, he whispered. Hear that? Hear what? William shushed him frantically. They sat stone still for a moment, ears straining, then Randall heard it. It was like a low moan, then a high whistle, as if the wind were sweeping across the wide plain before cutting through the valley around them. His eyes went back to the rift, then he gasped, almost dropping his shield and spear. It was wider now. Sound the alarm! He told William frantically, but his friend was frozen in fear, eyes riveted on the sight before them. William, sound the alarm! As William hurried to obey, the rift shimmered again, growing brighter, colors leaking out along its expanding edges. It seemed to split open, like a mouth ravenous for food, and shadows billowed forth. They spread rapidly, and Randall blinked, unable to see the rift out of the rubble below it anymore. Even William had vanished, though he could hear his friend blowing on the horn, alerting the other guards. Randall swiveled this way and that, trying to peer through the sudden darkness, his spear and shield at the ready. Was something there? Or there? He strained to listen. What was that sound? A thud, as if something had rolled over or dropped. Was that another? Yes, he was sure he had heard something now. He turned in the direction he thought it had come from, raising his spear slightly and hoping it wasn't William. Those definitely sounded like footsteps, heavy ones, many of them. Hold! Randall shouted, wishing his voice weren't shaky. Who goes there? Stand and identify yourself, in the name of the Alliance! The steps grew closer, and he spun, trying to pinpoint their source. Were they behind him? Off to his side? Right in front of him? He turned slightly as the ground shook beneath his feet, raising his shield instinctively, and cried out as something heavy crushed it like paper. The impact shattering his arm as well. Blinking away the pain, Randall thrust his spear forward, but something caught the weapon's long haft and wrenched it from his grip. A face appeared out of the darkness inches from his own, a wide, heavy face with a looming brow, squat nose, two sharp tusks jutting up from his lower lips. The horrifying face leered at Randall, and he had a brief glimpse of something else rushing toward him. From the shadows, something wide and flat and curved. The other guards rallied, alerted by William's horn, but it was too little too late. The darkness filled the valley, preventing them from even seeing their foes, and while the humans blundered about in confusion, orc warriors and death knights poured out of the newly expanded rift, crushing everyone in their path. It was more of a slaughter than a true battle. Within minutes, every human offender was dead or dying, and the orcs controlled the Azeroth side of the Dark Portal. Chapter 6. Whispers. Soft striations, barely heard unless listened for. The fluttering of a bird's wings in flight, the sound of a leaf drifting towards the earth. These were louder than the whispers that teased at Ner'zhul's ears. But he heard them. He held his skull in his hands, gazing deeply into the empty eye sockets, and heard Gul'dan's voice. It sounded to him as if it had life. Sympathetic, anxious for approval. eagerly answering questions and offering solutions, and yet simultaneously barely hiding a vast contempt and lust for power. Gul'dan in death hoped to lull his former master into the same false sense of security he had when he lived, but Ner'zhul would not be duped a second time. Inadvertently, Ner'zhul had betrayed his people with his gullibility, and this orc whose skull rested within his gnarled hands had risen to power by thinking he had grounded the old shaman into dirt. Who is alive and in power, and who is dead, eh, my apprentice? He whispered to the skull. He blinked suddenly, startled out of his conversation with the skull as light flooded his traveling tent. A figure stood silhouetting against the daylight that knifed through the gloom of the tent's interior. "We control the portal," Grom Hellscream announced. Ner'zhul smiled. Thus far, all had gone according to plan. He absently creased the yellow bone as he might a pet fawning for his attention. Fitting and just that Gul'dan's skull should help him reopen the rift. Ner'zhul waved Grom and his companions, Terran Gorfin, inside. He had appointed them his seconds, Gorfin overseeing the Death Knights and Ogres, and Grom conveying his orders to the various clans, and there were many clans now. The Thunderlords, Laughing Skull, and Bonechewer clans had joined them, leaving only the Redwalker clan, what was left of it. All of the clans had united under his leadership once more, making the Horde nearly as strong as it had been before the first attack on Azeroth. Nearly. "I am pleased," he said. "And now you know what to do. You must do next." "Oh, I know what to do," Gorfin assured the old shaman. "But are you sure you can maintain the rift by yourself?" Even with the skull's aid and suggestions, not that all of those had proven valuable or even reasonable, it had taken several Death Knights working in tandem to help Ner'zhul sufficiently widen the rift. "Arrogance. He should not speak to you so," came the soft whisper from the relic. No, he shouldn't." "I can manage," Ner'zhul replied shortly, feeling the power coiled within him, more power than he had felt in years. It was as if tapping into the skull's energies had awakened something deep within him, something he had never even realized he had been missing, and it felt good. "Once the framework is rebuilt there, the portal will maintain itself. Be off about your duties, Terran." From within the darkness of his hood, the Death Knight's eyes flickered slightly. Then he nodded curtly and turned on his heel, his cloak billowing behind him, and slipped out of the tent. Ner'zhul turned to Grom, who nodded. "I am ready, Ner'zhul. More than ready." "Very well. The sooner you begin, the sooner we can achieve our goals." Grom raised his axe in salute, then followed Gorfin. Ner'zhul lingered for a moment in the darkness, then emerged from the tent just in time to see Orcs and Death Knights stride up to the portal and step through it into the other worlds, a place he had never set foot upon himself. He stared at the rift, his fingers idly stroking the smooth surface of Gul'dan's skull. "Now you will never need to see this Azeroth. Soon, a greater glory will be yours," came the skull's eager, dead voice. "Yes," mused Ner'zhul. "Very soon." "What's news?" Terran Gorfin demanded of Gaz Soul Ripper, and his booted feet strode on Azerothian soil. The other Death Knights had led a handful of their brethren through the rift once it had opened, and was now in charge of the work on this side of the portal. While the Orcs provided the labor and would rebuild the portal from the rubble that was strewn about the area, it was the Death Knights who would make the portal more than a physical gateway. With their dark magics, they would be able to widen and stabilize the rift, so it would be be of a better use to the Horde.
I almost died too easily,
Soul Ripper replied, laughing.
with the darkness, they never stood a chance.
He gestured behind him to where Gorfiend's altered senses could pick out the framework, despite the magical shadows filling the valley.
We're progressing well with the framework. It should be up within the next day or two.
Gorfiend grunted, studying the work. A simple stone archway at the top of a short ramp had held the original dark portal when the portal had collapsed. The archway had fallen as well. The orcs had pressed into service for the task, had already cleared all those remains out of the way, and were busy assembling the stone blocks they had lugged through from Draenor. This framework would be more functional than decorative. With only a few orcish ruins hastily carved onto it. But as long as they could utilize the framework to stabilize the portal, he didn't care.
What of the other clans still on this world?
He asked.
We spoke to them through dreams and visions once we secured the valley,
Soul Ripper replied.
No idea how long it will take for any of them to reach us, though.
As it turned out, it was mere hours later that Gorfiend heard the sound of approaching footsteps. He rose from the boulder he had been leaning against, noticing that the portal was already nearly completion, and paused. The unnatural darkness still held. It would prevent the humans from mounting a counterattack too quickly, and would keep them guessing. But it did not much slow down either orcs or death knights, and the footsteps drew steadily closer. At last, a band of orcs marched into view. They were battered and worn, barely 36, but they held their heads high and their weapons ready. Before them strode an older orc, his body still powerful despite advanced years, his head turning constantly as they drew closer. Gorfiend recognized him and realized why he moved his head so. The orc only had one eye. The other was a mass of scar tissue, and Gorfiend remembered the many rumors of how Kilrog Deadeye had lost that orb, and what he had gained in return. Gorfiend moved forward to meet the bleeding hollow chieftain.
Kilrog,
he called out as he approached. It was not a good idea to approach Kilrog without warning. The chieftain's head swiveled about until the one eye locked on Gorfiend.
Gorfiend,
he called in return, stepping up and gesturing for his warriors to spread themselves out behind him.
I had a vision you were here.
The Death Knight nodded. He watched Kilrog's gaze track past him to the almost completed dark portal.
So it is true,
the chieftain said softly.
The portal has been restored.
True, Gorfiend replied.
We came from Draenor, and you can return there. Has the land been restored to life? Draenor is still dying,
Gorfiend acknowledged.
But Ner'zhul has a plan.
That only made Kilrog's scowl deepen. However,
Ner'zhul, that old fool. What is his involvement here? I saw him too in my vision, but thought that merely an image from the past. An image from our future, more like,
Gorfiend responded.
Ner'zhul has taken control again, and has reforged the Horde. He has united all the remaining clans on Draenor.
He conveniently ignored the Redwalker clan, which was barely alive now anyways.
And reopened the rift. And he has a plan that would ensure the survival of our people, if not our world.
Kilrog scratched the scar tissue beneath his missing eye.
He has done all this plan. You think it is sound?
Gorfiend nodded.
Perhaps he's finally shaken off the weakness and doubt Gul'dan inflicted upon him. Then, if he is anything like the Ner'zhul of old, I will gladly follow him.
He shook his head and lowered his voice.
And in truth, I would happily forsake this world for our own, even of its current state. We have been trapped here too long.
Gorfing nodded. Go, then, he urged the Bleeding Hollow chieftain. Ner'zhul and the others await you beyond the portal. I know your experience and wisdom will be of great value to them. But first, tell me, what's of the other orcs still here?
Aside from the Frostwolves, who will have nothing to do with the rest of us, there are only 2 other clans not in captivity,
Kilrog said.
the Dragon Maw and the Blackrock.
He grimaced.
The Dragon Maw remain hidden in the mountains somewhere, safe from human eyes, and they still control the Red Dragons. They formed an alliance with the Blackrock a year ago. Red and Mane Blackhand lead the Blackrocks and have claimed Blackrock Spire as their own. He shrugged. I'd not want the sight of Doomhammer's defeat as my base, but then the brothers never cared for him.
This was not good news.
Will they return to the portal and to Draenor, do you think?
Gorfing asked. Kilrog shook his head.
Nay, they seem content to remain on Azeroth, he replied. I did not expect them to.
Gorfing scowled but nodded.
Many thanks, Kilrog. Now go. Draenor awaits.
Kilrog nodded and turned away, leading his warriors up the ramp to the restored portal, which shimmered even in the darkness.
Onward to Draenor!
He bellowed, pointing, and the first warrior strode through the portal without hesitation, followed by the rest. Kilrog himself went last. When he glanced back at the valley and at Azeroth, he lifted his weapon.
A warrior's retreat, but only to regroup. I will return, he vowed. This world and its people will know my wrath.
Then he too stepped through and was gone. Grom Hellscream watched the Bleeding Hollow warriors vanish through the portal. He was pleased to see that Kilrog had survived. The older chieftain had always been one of the canniest of the Horde leaders and one of the fiercest tacticians. He was sure Kilrog's experience would prove valuable soon. Turning back to the orc who had just approached, Grom nodded for the warrior to continue.
The humans have not been idle. A large fortress stands to the north, the scout replied. It guards the pass out of this area. There's no other way past.
Grom grinned.
Perfect, he said slowly. That is our target. We'll take the fortress, and we can hold this valley indefinitely, no matter what this human alliance throws at us.
He nodded to the scout.
Tell the others to prepare. We will march at once.
The scout nodded. Before he could move away, Grom held up a hand for silence. He paused, listening closely. It sounded like footsteps, but faster, harder, and with a strange echo. More like a beast than a man, but if so, it was a heavy beast, with solid hooves rather than soft paws. He heard about the humans and their strange steeds, horses they were called, and guessed that was approaching.
Humans approach!
He shouted immediately, raising Gorehowl and whipping it around overhead.
Dispel the darkness!
He did not know where the Death Knights were, or even which ones had been maintaining the unnatural shadows that covered the valley, but they heard him. The darkness began to fade, light seeping through a wisp at a time, color washing across the valley, even as the dark ebbed away, until at last he could see the place clearly. There stood the dark portal, fully restored. Up to the north, he spotted stone towers, the fortress his scouts had mentioned, but now, through the narrow pass from that direction, came a force of men, astride beasts with gleaming hides and long flowing manes and tails. At the front of the wave of warriors was a man who wore metal across his chest, dark blue but with pattern like a twin flames outlined in gold. He waved his sword overhead, driving his horse forward without pause. This, then, was their leader. Gron grinned and raised Gorehowl again. With the darkness gone, its blade shone silver in the daylight. He swung it in a slow arc, his grin widened as the weapon sang its war song of approaching death. Several of the humans faltered.
For the Horde!
He shouted, charging forward. His warriors were right behind him. The humans hesitated, thrown off by the strange darkness they'd just seen slip away, surprised to find a mass of orcs now charging towards them, and terrified by the shrieks and howls arising not just from the approaching green-skinned warriors, but from their very weapons. And for the first rank of humans, that hesitation proved deadly. Grom struck first. Gorhowl slicing the lead rider from shoulder to opposite hip. The top half of the corpse slid from the horse, even as the bottom half toppled the other way. Grom never saw it fall. He was already on the next target, spinning to remove the legs of two more warriors as he stepped between them. The orcs strode between the beasts, slicing into steed and their rider alike, sending some horses careening back into and even over many of the Alliance foot soldiers. The force had marched into the valley was sizable, but nothing compared with the clans Grom had brought with him, and the orcs had surprise and focus on their side. The humans fought bravely. Grom would grant them that, and some showed skill at arms, but they lacked the orc's size and strength, and he found it an easy matter to overpower a human fighter and carve him open right through the strange metal shirt they all wore. For a sweet time, he let the bloodlust take control, hacking and slashing savagely about him, caring for nothing more than the spatter of blood, the reek of death, and the cries of the wounded and dying. How glorious to again kill without concern or guilt. No fellow orcs fell beneath Gorhowl, only the pink-skinned humans, one after another, and their fear and screams were intoxicating. His blood pounding in his veins, his vision had strange spots of color around the edges, and he was gasping for breath, but Grom had never felt more alive. Good. It was good. There came the momentary lull in the fighting, and he glanced around. Everywhere he looked, he saw human corpses, dozens of them, their eyes staring, fear twisting their features, blood still pumping from. Grom frowned, the bloodlust starting to retreat. Yes, dozens of corpses, but the humans he had noted, the one with the golden chest plate. Where was he? He growled and shook his black head, forcing the bloodlust back so he could listen to the warrior's instincts. Ignoring the shouts and cheers of his warriors, Grom ran towards the edge of the valley. Then he stopped to listen. Yes, he could definitely hear hoofbeats. They were receding fast. Someone had survived and had the sense to run away, back to the fortress. Returning to the battlefield, Grom found Gorfine seizing his arm. Grom shouted,
"One of them has escaped! The leader, I think. He's heading for the fortress!"
Gorfine nodded.
Follow him,
he replied, yelling as Grom had been to hear over the din.
And keep the Alliance forces in that fortress busy. We need to get to the artifacts. We should be back in a matter of days.
Grom nodded.
"You need not worry," he promised. "I will do my duty. See to it you do yours."
The Death Knight laughed and turned away without further reply, dismissing the Warsong clan leader. He extended his mauled hand, and a bolt of darkness exploded from them to flatten two horses and their riders. Grom ground his teeth together. He disliked Gorfine and all the Death Knights, in fact. They had already lived their lives and had returned from death itself, trapped now in human bodies. But how could such unnatural creatures be trusted? But Ner'zhul had approved Gorfine's plan, and so Grom had no choice but to go along with it. He just hoped the Death Knight was right, and that these strange items they were so doggedly hunting really would allow Ner'zhul to save their people. In the meantime, he had orders. He was only too happy to obey.
"A handful of you stay here," he instructed his warriors. "The rest of you and the other clans come with me."
He grinned and raised Gorhowl high.
"We have a fortress to take."